The warm summer evening was slowly turning into night as the streets of downtown Milwaukee came alive with its usual Friday buzz. The clock had just struck 9:30 p.m., and the mix of neon signs from bars and restaurants cast colorful shadows on the wet pavement from an earlier rain. Staff Sergeant James Cooper was riding his well-maintained Harley-Davidson Street Glide, a motorcycle he had saved up for during his last deployment. James was tired but content after finishing his shift at the local Veterans Support Center, where he helped fellow servicemen adjust to civilian life. His motorcycle purred smoothly beneath him as he navigated through the busy streets, his military patches and stickers visible on his riding jacket and bike, proud symbols of his service to his country. At 32, James carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 3 tours of duty and years of specialized combat training. His face showed the weathered experience of someone who had seen more than most people his age, but his eyes remained alert and observant, a habit he never lost since his time in service. The streets were busier than usual tonight. A popular bike rally was happening on the outskirts of town, bringing in riders from all over the state. While most were law-abiding enthusiasts, some questionable groups had also rolled into Milwaukee, marking their territory with loud engines and aggressive riding. As James stopped at a red light on Marshall Street, he noticed a group of bikers causing trouble 2 blocks ahead. Through his helmet visor, you could see them harassing other motorists, revving their engines unnecessarily and blocking traffic. Their bikes were decorated with gang symbols he recognized from his police friends' warnings about a notorious local group called the Street Kings. The group consisted of about 8 riders, their motorcycles modified to be unnecessarily loud, with crude modifications and spray-painted designs that screamed of intimidation rather than style. Their leader, a bulky man with a sleeveless leather vest covered in threatening patches, was gesturing wildly at a scared elderly couple in a sedan. James checked his mirrors, noting possible escape routes, a habit ingrained from his military training. He could turn right at the next intersection and avoid the trouble altogether, but that would mean leaving other civilians to deal with these troublemakers. It wasn't in his nature to look the other way when others might need help. The evening air was thick with humidity, and the rumble of distant thunder suggested another storm was approaching. Street lights flickered on one by one, and the sidewalks were filled with people heading to bars and restaurants, many of them casting worried glances at the rowdy bikers ahead. James maintained a steady speed as he approached the next intersection. His training had taught him to stay calm and assess situations before acting. He noticed how the gang members were positioning themselves across the lanes, a tactic he recognized as a way to control traffic flow and intimidate other drivers. Through his rearview mirrors, he saw 2 more bikers from the same gang approaching from behind, their aggressive riding style making their intentions clear. They were boxing him in, probably having noticed his military insignias. James had heard about this gang targeting veterans before, seeing them as challenging their supposed street dominance. The air grew tenser as James drew closer to the main group. He could now clearly see their faces, most of them young men trying to look tough, but their eyes showed the kind of insecurity that often led to violence. The gang's patches indicated they were the same group responsible for several recent assaults in the area. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the scene like a warning sign from nature itself. James checked his phone mount, making sure the camera was recording, another habit he'd developed after years of riding in the city. His grip on the handlebars remained relaxed but ready, his body position neutral but prepared. The leader of the gang noticed James approaching and nudged his companions, pointing at the military stickers on James's bike. Their mocking laughter carried over the sound of engines, and they began to spread out across the lanes, creating a wall of motorcycles ahead. As the situation was unfolding, James remembered his combat instructor's words. The best fight is the one you can avoid, but when you can't avoid it, make sure you're prepared. He was prepared, right. 6 years of Marine Corps training had made sure of that. But he hoped it wouldn't come to that, even as the gang members began revving their engines more aggressively, clearly trying to provoke a response. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about incidents in recent Milwaukee history, though none of the participants knew it yet. All they knew was that the humid summer air was charged with tension, and something was about to break. The first direct confrontation happened suddenly, as the lead biker swerved his motorcycle deliberately into James's lane, cutting him off with barely inches to spare. The screech of tires and the acrid smell of burning rubber filled the air as James skillfully maintained control of his bike, avoiding what could have been a dangerous collision. "Look what we got here, boys," the lead biker shouted, his voice carrying over the rumble of engines. "A military boy who thinks he owns these streets." His face was twisted in a mocking grin, visible through his half-helmet. The man was tall and heavily built, with tattoos covering his thick arms and a long beard braided with metal beads. James remained silent, his military training kicking in as he calmly assessed the situation. 5 bikers had now positioned themselves around him, 2 on each side and 1 directly in front. Through his mirrors, he could see 2 more pulling up behind him, effectively boxing him in at the red light. Their intentions were clear. This wasn't going to be a friendly encounter. "Nice patches you got there, soldier boy," sneered one of the bikers to his right, a skinny man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck. He pointed to James's service patches with a dirty finger. "Bet you think they make you special, huh?" The others laughed, their voices mixing with the aggressive revving of their engines. The traffic light remained red, seeming to stretch time into an eternity. Civilian cars around them began backing away, their drivers sensing the growing tension. A young woman in a nearby car was already on her phone, likely calling the police, while others pulled out their phones to record the scene. One of the bikers circled James's motorcycle slowly, dragging a heavy chain across the ground. The metallic scraping sound was meant to intimidate, but James's expression remained neutral behind his visor. He noticed how the gang members positioned themselves. They'd done this before, probably to other unsuspecting victims. "Those military stickers," the lead biker continued, pointing at James's motorcycle. "They don't mean shit here. This is our territory." He revved his engine aggressively, the sound echoing off the surrounding buildings. The smell of exhaust fumes filled the air, mixing with the lingering humidity from the earlier rain. James noticed small details about each biker, their positions, their likely weapons, their level of aggression. The leader was clearly experienced in street fights, given his stance. 2 others showed signs of drug use, their movements jerky and unpredictable. The ones behind him seemed newer to the gang, trying too hard to appear threatening. Lightning flashed again in the distance, closer now, illuminating the scene in brief, stark bursts. The streetlights cast long shadows across the wet pavement, creating an almost theatrical setting for what was unfolding. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalks, keeping their distance but watching intently. "Maybe we should teach him how we deal with this kind around here," suggested another gang member, cracking his knuckles for effect. He wore spiked leather gloves and had brass knuckles poorly concealed in his vest pocket. The others murmured in agreement, their bikes inching closer to James. The traffic light finally turned green, but the bikers didn't move. Instead, they tightened their circle around James. Cars behind them began honking, but quickly fell silent when one of the gang members turned and gave them a threatening look. "What's wrong, soldier?" taunted the leader. "Cat got your tongue? Or did they teach you to be a coward in the military?" His words were met with mocking laughter from his companions, who were now close enough that their bikes nearly touched James's. Through all of this, James remained perfectly still, his hands relaxed but ready on his handlebars. His military training had taught him the importance of staying calm under pressure, and right now, every sense was alert, taking in the situation. He noticed how the leader favored his right side, how 2 of the bikers seemed nervous despite their tough act, and how their formation had one weak spot, to his left rear. The tension in the air was almost electric, matching the approaching storm. More phones were out now, recording the scene from various angles. The gang members seemed to enjoy the attention, playing up their threatening behavior for their impromptu audience. None of them realized they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives by choosing to harass this particular veteran. The next few moments would prove just how wrong they were in assuming James would be an easy target. The situation escalated when one of the bikers, growing impatient with James's calm demeanor, kicked out at his motorcycle. The heavy boot missed the chrome by inches, but the intent was clear. James watched through his visor as the gang members became increasingly agitated by his lack of response to their provocations. "Get off the bike, tough guy," growled the leader, pulling something metallic from his vest pocket. The streetlights glinted off what appeared to be brass knuckles, now wrapped around his thick fingers. The other gang members shifted their positions, some reaching for concealed weapons of their own, chains, pipes, and what looked like a switchblade. James's combat-trained mind was already mapping out every detail of his surroundings. To his left, a narrow alley offered a potential escape route. Behind him, about 30 feet away, a police camera was mounted on a traffic light. Everything was being recorded. The growing crowd of onlookers had wisely moved back, creating a sort of impromptu arena on the street. Thunder rolled overhead, closer now, and a few drops of rain began to fall. The street lights created gleaming reflections on the wet pavement, turning the scene into something out of a tense action movie. But this was no movie, and James knew the next few moments would determine how this night ended. "Look at him, probably scared stiff," laughed the skinny biker with the snake tattoo, emboldened by James's continued silence. He revved his engine aggressively, the sound echoing off the surrounding buildings. "Maybe we should help him off that nice bike of his." The leader circled closer, his bike's exhaust pipes deliberately coming near James's leg, the heat noticeable even through his riding jeans. "Last chance, soldier boy. Either you get off that bike willingly, or we'll make you get off." His voice carried the confidence of someone used to getting his way through intimidation. James noticed how the gang had made a crucial mistake in their positioning. Two of them had drifted slightly too far apart, creating a gap he could exploit if needed. His years of tactical training had taught him to spot such details that could mean the difference between victory and defeat in a confrontation. The rain started falling harder now, drops hitting their leather jackets and creating a light mist in the air. The humid atmosphere grew thicker with tension as the gang members continued their intimidation tactics. One of them revved his engine so hard it backfired, causing several onlookers to jump. Through his helmet's visor, James could see the various weapons now being openly displayed. The leader's brass knuckles gleamed dully in the streetlight. Two others had heavy chains wrapped around their handlebars, ready to be used. The youngest-looking member, trying to prove himself, pulled out a switchblade, its blade catching the neon reflections from nearby store signs. "Maybe he needs some motivation," suggested one of the bikers behind James, pulling up closer. The smell of leather, exhaust fumes, and rain filled the air as the circle tightened around him. The gang members were getting cocky, assuming their numerical advantage guaranteed their success. James remained motionless, but his mind was racing through scenarios, analyzing angles, calculating distances. His combat experience had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was just before it turned physical. He knew these men were used to their victims either running away or making desperate, panicked moves. The leader, frustrated by James's continued calm, made his first serious mistake. He reached out to grab James's handlebar, trying to force a reaction. "I said, get off the damn bike," he snarled, his face twisted with anger and growing uncertainty at James's composure. What none of the gang members realized was that they had inadvertently surrounded one of the most highly trained combat specialists in the state. James had spent years perfecting his skills, not just in standard military combat, but in advanced close-quarters fighting techniques. He was no ordinary veteran. The rain was falling steadily now, creating a slight steam rise from the hot engines of their motorcycles. The scene had taken on an almost surreal quality, the neon lights, the rain, the steam, and the tension all combining into something that felt like the calm before a storm. As the leader's hand reached for James's handlebar, time seemed to slow down. In that moment, James knew the situation had crossed a line. These men had made their choice, and now they would have to deal with the consequences of choosing the wrong target for their intimidation. One of the bikers made the crucial mistake of spitting directly on James's service patch, the saliva mixing with the falling rain on his jacket. The crowd that had gathered collectively gasped at this blatant show of disrespect. For the first time since the confrontation began, something changed in James's demeanor, not anger, but a quiet, deadly focus. With deliberate calmness, James switched off his motorcycle's engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the sound of rain and the aggressive revving of the gang members' bikes. His movements were smooth and controlled as he pushed down his kickstand and dismounted his Harley. "Look at this, boys," the leader laughed nervously, trying to hide his growing unease at James's controlled response. Soldier Boy's finally ready to play, but something in James's methodical movements made him tighten his grip on his brass knuckles. James removed his globes slowly, tucking them into his jacket pocket. Each movement was precise, economical, like a boxer preparing for a match. The rain continued to fall, creating a misty backdrop to the scene that was about to unfold. "When I was in combat," James spoke for the first time, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise, "we had a saying, 'Slow is smooth, smoothed his fast. He unbuckled his helmet, his eyes never leaving the gang leader. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, sensing something different about this veteran. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo tried to circle behind James, chain dragging on the wet pavement. Without turning his head, James called out, "That's not a good idea, son. Your footwork gives away your intentions." The biker froze, surprised at being rid so easily. As James removed his helmet, the gang members got their first clear look at his face. His features were calm, but his eyes were alert, scanning constantly, taking in every detail. Years of combat experience had taught him to notice everything: the nervous twitch of the youngest gang member's hand, the way the leader favored his right side, the uncertain glances between the others. "Last chance to walk away," James stated clearly, placing his helmet on his bike's seat. "What happens next is your choice." His voice carried no threat, just a simple statement of fact. Some of the gang members exchanged uncertain looks, their earlier confidence wavering. The leader, feeling his authority slipping, made a show of cracking his knuckles. 7 against 1, military man. Those ain't good odds. He tried to sound confident, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "You're right about the numbers," James replied calmly, rolling his shoulders to loosen them. "There are 7 of you. That means 7 different angles of attack, 7 different levels of experience, 7 different mistakes waiting to happen." His voice remained steady, educational almost, as if he were teaching a class. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, despite the rain. Many had their phones out, recording everything. The streetlights cast long shadows across the wet pavement, creating an almost theatrical setting for what was about to unfold. In combat, James continued, his eyes moving constantly, tracking every subtle movement. Numbers can be a disadvantage. Too many people, too little coordination, too much confusion. He shifted his weight slightly, barely noticeable but positioning himself perfectly. The gang members were growing increasingly unsettled. This wasn't how their victims usually behaved. There was no fear, no panic, no desperate pleading. Instead, they faced a man who seemed to be calmly preparing for something they weren't sure they were ready for. Lightning flashed again, closer now, illuminating James's face. In that brief, bright moment, the gang members saw something in his eyes, not anger or fear, but the focused determination of someone who had faced far worse situations and emerged victorious. "I'd noticed 7 weapons," James said quietly, almost to himself. 2 chains, 1 pipe, 2 knives, brass knuckles, and whatever's in the back pocket of the nervous one on the right. The young biker he referred to instinctively reached for his back pocket, shocked at being so easily read. The rain continued to fall steadily, soaking through their clothes and creating small rivers on the street. The moment stretched out, tense and electric, like the calm before a storm. James stood relaxed but ready, his position perfect for either defense or attack. What happened next would be talked about in the neighborhood for months to come, a lesson in why it's unwise to mistake military courtesy for weakness or training for vulnerability. The tension reached its peak as James calmly removed his helmet, revealing a face marked with quiet confidence and years of combat experience. The rain had picked up, drops rolling down his weathered features as he carefully placed his helmet on his bike's handlebars. His movements were deliberate and controlled, each motion carrying the precision of a trained warrior. "Gentlemen," James spoke for the first time, his voice steady and clear over the rumble of engines. "I'm Staff Sergeant James Cooper, United States Marine Corps. Combat instructor, 3 tours of duty." He paused, making eye contact with each gang member. "I'm giving you 1 chance to walk away from this." The leader's face twisted into a sneer, but something in James's calm demeanor made him hesitate for a split second. The other gang members shifted uncomfortably, sensing something different about this veteran. This wasn't the nervous reaction they were used to seeing from their victims. "You think that fancy title scares us?" the leader barked, trying to hide his uncertainty. "There's 7 of us and 1 of you, military man." He flexed his fingers around his brass knuckles, the metal catching the gleam of nearby neon signs. James remained perfectly still, but his eyes were constantly moving, tracking each potential threat. "I'm also a certified instructor in Marine Corps martial arts program," he continued, his voice remaining even. "Specialized in close quarters combat and battlefield survival. Again, I suggest you walk away." The skinny biker with the snake tattoo laughed nervously. Listen to this guy. Thinks he's some kind of action hero. But his laughter sounded forced, and his hands trembled slightly on his handlebars. Rain continued to fall, creating a misty backdrop to the scene. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones out, recording everything. The streetlights cast long shadows across the wet pavement, adding to the dramatic tension of the moment. Last warning, James stated firmly. I've been trained to handle multiple armed opponents. I've done it before, and I really don't want to do it again. His eyes locked onto the leaders. But I will if you force me to. The leader, feeling his authority challenged in front of his gang, made his decision. Get him, he shouted, swinging his brass-knuckled fist toward James's face. The other gang members moved in, their weapons raised. What happened next would later be viewed thousands of times on social media. James's stance shifted ever so slightly, his weight distributing evenly on both feet. His face showed no anger, no fear, just the focused concentration of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of situation. Remember, you chose this? James said quietly, almost to himself. The rain had soaked through his jacket now, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes tracked every movement around him, calculating angles and distances with military precision. The crowd had grown larger, despite the rain. People stood under store awnings and doorways, phones recording the scene. Some had already called the police, but everyone could sense that this confrontation would be over before they arrived. I've handled insurgents in urban combat zones, James continued, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret. This doesn't have to end badly for you. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his entire body was ready to move. The leader, now committed to his course of action, stepped forward aggressively. Shut up and fight, soldier boy. He growled, raising his brass knuckles. Two other gang members moved in from the sides, chain and pike ready. James made one final attempt at de-escalation. I've been in real combat, gentlemen. This isn't a movie or a street fight. I'm trained to permanently disable threats. His words carried the weight of experience, making even the most aggressive gang members pause. But their pride and reputation were on the line. The leader had gone too far to back down now. With a roar of rage, he launched his attack, brass knuckles gleaming in the streetlight. The other gang members followed suit, moving in with their weapons raised. Time seemed to slow down as James watched them approach. His combat training kicked in fully, his mind already several moves ahead. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of water that would soon witness a demonstration of why picking a fight with a highly trained Marine combat instructor was a serious mistake. What happened in the next few seconds would become legendary in the neighborhood, a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that true combat skill comes not from numbers or weapons, but from training, experience, and disciplined control. What happened next was like a scene from a perfectly choreographed action sequence, except this was real. The leader's brass-knuckled punch cut through the rain, aimed at James's face with full force. But James wasn't there anymore. With a fluid movement that spoke of years of training, he had already shifted slightly to the left. The leader's momentum carried him forward into empty air. Before he could recover, James's hand clamped onto his extended arm. In one smooth motion, James redirected the gang leader's force, using his own body weight against him. The leader found himself flying over James's hip, crashing hard onto the wet pavement with a heavy thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. Two more gang members rushed in simultaneously, one with a chain, the other wielding a metal pipe. James moved like water between raindrops. He stepped into the space between them, causing them to adjust their attacks awkwardly to avoid hitting each other. The chain whistled through the air where James's head had been a split second before. The Marine's counterattack was swift and precise. His elbow found the pike wielder's solar plexus with surgical accuracy, followed by a quick strike to the man's wrist that sent the pike clattering across the wet street. The man dropped to his knees, gasping for air. The chain wielder swung again, but James had already closed the distance. He trapped the chain against the biker's chest with one hand while his other hand delivered a precise strike to the man's collarbone. Not enough to break it, but sufficient to send waves of pain through his shoulder. The chain fell from nerveless fingers. Stay down, James commanded to the fallen men, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed in combat situations. The rain continued to fall, making the pavement slick and treacherous. The remaining gang members hesitated, witnessing how quickly 3 of their companions had been neutralized. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo backed his motorcycle up slightly, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of real combat skill. But 2 of the younger members, eager to prove themselves, rushed forward together. One pulled a switchblade, while the other attempted to grab James from behind. Their lack of training was evident in their uncoordinated attack. James moved with the efficiency of a predator. He seized the knife wielder's wrist, turning it slightly, not enough to break it, but enough to send sharp pain shooting up the young man's arm. The switchblade clattered to the ground. In the same fluid motion, James used the knife wielder's body as a shield against his companion's grab attempt. The young gang member with the knife found himself being guided, rather than thrown, into his friend. Both of them stumbled and fell, landing hard on the wet pavement. James had complete control of the situation, using just enough force to neutralize threats without causing serious injury. The last 2 gang members, seeing their companions disabled so efficiently, revved their motorcycles and retreated hastily, leaving their fallen friends behind. Their bikes roared off into the rainy night, their taillights disappearing around a corner. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. 5 gang members lay on the wet ground, none seriously injured but all thoroughly defeated. The leader, still trying to catch his breath, stared up at James with a mixture of shock and fear. James stood calmly in the rain, his stance relaxed but ready. Water dripped from his hair and jacket, but his breathing was steady and controlled. He hadn't even broken a sweat. The gathered crowd, which had been filming everything on their phones, stood in stunned silence. "Combat isn't about size or numbers," James said quietly to the fallen leader. "It's about training, discipline, and control." He moved smoothly between the fallen gang members, checking each one to ensure none were seriously hurt. His movements remained precise and vigilant, knowing that defeated opponents could still be dangerous. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, mixing with the steady patter of rain. Blue and red lights began to reflect off the wet buildings and windows. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, despite the rain, their phones still recording every moment. James returned to his motorcycle, his movements still careful and controlled. He knew the police would want statements, and the videos from bystanders would corroborate his account of self-defense. The gang members, realizing their situation, remained on the ground, some groaning, others simply lying there in stunned silence. The rain continued to fall, washing away the tension of the confrontation. In less than a minute, a highly trained Marine had demonstrated why it was a serious mistake to mistake military courtesy for weakness and training for vulnerability. The police arrived with sirens wailing, their red and blue lights cutting through the rain and reflecting off the wet pavement. 3 patrol cars pulled up to the scene, followed by an unmarked detective's vehicle. The officers emerged with hands on their weapons, initially unsure of what they were walking into. What they found was a scene of remarkable calm. James stood quietly beside his motorcycle, hands visible and posture non-threatening. 5 gang members remained on the ground, none seriously injured but all thoroughly subdued. The gathered crowd, still recording with their phones, parted to let the officers through. "Officer," James called out calmly, addressing the first policeman who approached. "Staff Sergeant James Cooper, United States Marine Corps. I have my military ID ready." His voice carried the same steady authority he'd maintained throughout the entire incident. Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran officer with 15 years on the force, took charge of the scene. She'd been tracking this particular gang's activities for months, and now they'd literally fallen into her lap. As she approached James, she noticed his professional demeanor and the military patches on his jacket. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Detective Martinez asked, pulling out her notebook. Before James could answer, several members of the crowd stepped forward eagerly. "We got it all on video," a young woman called out, holding up her phone. "These guys surrounded him and threatened him. He tried to warn them off, but they attacked first." Others in the crowd nodded in agreement, many already sending their videos to the police department's tip line. The shop owner from the corner store emerged with his security footage ready to share. "My cameras caught everything," he said, holding up a USB drive. "These thugs have been causing trouble here for months, but this Marine, he handled it perfectly. Didn't even hurt them badly." Officers began collecting statements from witnesses while paramedics checked the gang members for injuries. The leader, still catching his breath, refused medical attention but couldn't refuse the handcuffs being placed on his wrists. His brass knuckles lay nearby, documented as evidence by crime scene photographers. Detective Martinez watched the security footage on the shop owner's computer, her eyebrows rising as she observed James's skilled defense. "Textbook self-defense," she muttered, making notes. "Perfect control and minimal force used." The rain had started to ease up as more police units arrived. Officers were collecting the weapons dropped by the gang members, the chain, pipe, and switchblade all carefully tagged and bagged as evidence. Photographs were taken of the scene, including the skid marks on the wet pavement where the motorcycles had been. Local news vans began arriving, drawn by the police activity and the viral videos already circulating on social media. James remained calm and professional, giving his statement clearly and concisely to Detective Martinez. "They surrounded me, made threats, and attempted to assault me," he explained, pointing out the positions and sequence of events. "I identified myself as a Marine Corps combat instructor and gave them multiple warnings to walk away. When they attacked, I used minimum necessary force to neutralize the threat." The detective nodded, impressed by both his actions and his clear, professional report. "Your restraint is commendable, Sergeant. Most people would have panicked in that situation." She looked at her notes. "We've been trying to build a case against this gang for months. This might be what we needed." The two gang members who had fled were quickly identified from the videos and security footage. Police units were already being dispatched to their known addresses. The remaining 5 were arrested on multiple charges, including attempted assault, weapons possession, and gang activity. As the scene was being processed, several veterans from nearby businesses had gathered, showing silent support for James. They recognized the patches on his jacket and understood the situation all too well. Many of them had faced similar harassment from the gang. The shop owner approached James with a cup of hot coffee. "On the house," he said with a grateful smile. "What you did tonight. Maybe now they'll think twice before causing trouble here again." Detective Martinez finished taking statements and approached James one last time. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to complete some paperwork, but you're free to go now, Sergeant. Thank you for handling this situation so professionally." The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. As James prepared to leave, several officers shook his hand, and the crowd gave him a spontaneous round of applause. He had demonstrated something important tonight, that true strength lies not in the ability to harm, but in the disciplined capacity to protect while causing minimal harm. The night's events would have far-reaching consequences for both the neighborhood and the gang that had terrorized it for so long. But for now, James simply wanted to head home, knowing he had handled the situation exactly as his training had prepared him to do. One of the bikers made the crucial mistake of spitting directly on James's service patch, the saliva mixing with the falling rain on his jacket. The crowd that had gathered collectively gasped at this blatant show of disrespect. For the first time since the confrontation began, something changed in James's demeanor, not anger, but a quiet, deadly focus. With deliberate calmness, James switched off his motorcycle's engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the sound of rain and the aggressive revving of the gang members' bikes. His movements were smooth and controlled as he pushed down his kickstand and dismounted his Harley. "Look at this, boys," the leader laughed nervously, trying to hide his growing unease at James's controlled response. Soldier boys finally ready to play. But something in James's methodical movements made him tighten his grip on his brass knuckles. James removed his gloves slowly, tucking them into his jacket pocket. Each movement was precise, economical, like a boxer preparing for a match. The rain continued to fall, creating a misty backdrop to the scene that was about to unfold. "When I was in combat," James spoke for the first time, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise, "we had a saying, 'Slow is smooth, smooth is fast.'" He unbuckled his helmet, his eyes never leaving the gang leader. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, sensing something different about this veteran. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo tried to circle behind James, chain dragging on the wet pavement. Without turning his head, James called out, "That's not a good idea, son. Your footwork gives away your intentions." The biker froze, surprised at being rid so easily. As James removed his helmet, the gang members got their first clear look at his face. His features were calm, but his eyes were alert, scanning constantly, taking in every detail. Years of combat experience had taught him to notice everything: the nervous twitch of the youngest gang member's hand, the way the leader favored his right side, the uncertain glances between the others. Last chance to walk away, James stated clearly, placing his helmet on his bike's seat. What happens next is your choice. His voice carried no threat, just a simple statement of fact. Some of the gang members exchanged uncertain looks, their earlier confidence wavering. The leader, feeling his authority slipping, made a show of cracking his knuckles. 7 against 1, military man. Those ain't good odds. He tried to sound confident, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. You're right about the numbers, James replied calmly, rolling his shoulders to loosen them. There are 7 of you. That means 7 different angles of attack, 7 different levels of experience, 7 different mistakes waiting to happen. His voice remained steady, educational almost, as if he were teaching a class. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, despite the rain. Many had their phones out, recording everything. The street lights cast long shadows across the wet pavement, creating an almost theatrical setting for what was about to unfold. In combat, James continued, his eyes moving constantly, tracking every subtle movement. Numbers can be a disadvantage. Too many people, too little coordination, too much confusion. He shifted his weight slightly, barely noticeable but positioning himself perfectly. The gang members were growing increasingly unsettled. This wasn't how their victims usually behaved. There was no fear, no panic, no desperate pleading. Instead, they faced a man who seemed to be calmly preparing for something they weren't sure they were ready for. Lightning flashed again, closer now, illuminating James's face. In that brief, bright moment, the gang members saw something in his eyes, not anger or fear, but the focused determination of someone who had faced far worse situations and emerged victorious. I've noticed 7 weapons, James said quietly, almost to himself. 2 chains, 1 pipe, 2 knives, brass knuckles, and whatever's in the back pocket of the nervous one on the right. The young biker he referred to instinctively reached for his back pocket, shocked at being so easily read. The rain continued to fall steadily, soaking through their clothes and creating small rivers on the street. The moments stretched out, tense and electric, like the calm before a storm. James stood relaxed but ready, his position perfect for either defense or attack. What happened next would be talked about in the neighborhood for months to come, a lesson in why it's unwise to mistake military courtesy for weakness, or training for vulnerability.